Hello and welcome back to The Next Page, the podcast of the UN Library and Archives, Geneva. I'm Amy Smith, and today we're going to talk again about the Summit for the Future. We've had many episodes on this in 2024, and we decided that it was going to be very interesting to talk about civil society's involvement in this process and what we can hope for and work towards following the adoption of the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact and the Declaration on Future Generations that were adopted by consensus at the summit in September of 2024. Our guest today is Daniel Perell, and he is the representative to the UN of an NGO, the Baha'i International Community. So Daniel, welcome. It's so nice to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Would you tell our audience a little bit about yourself? And since the podcast is also about multilateralism, perhaps you could tell us why you think multilateralism is relevant.
Sure. Well, a little about myself could be a wide-ranging answer, but maybe I'll confine it to this space. I serve as a representative for the Baha'i International Community's UN office. I sit in New York, but travel wherever the UN happens to take me. I've been in this role for about 13, 14 years. And I think at the broadest level, the interest in multilateralism is around the reality that humanity is confronting challenges at scales that we've never seen before. Our previously held notions of borders and communities are becoming far more interrelated, interconnected in ways that we haven't yet figured out how to govern. So whereas historically, perhaps things could have stayed within a certain geographical scope, we now see that they cannot and they do not. And so the question before us is, where are the spaces that we can actually address these global challenges? And the United Nations, for sure, is the most preeminent of these spaces. And so here I am, trying to learn alongside many well-meaning, thoughtful, and generous others who are trying to advance the same aspirations.
Wonderful. Yes, this really fits with our theme of the evolution of multilateralism. I just wanted to say that we invited you to join us for the podcast today because we'd listened to an episode that you recorded with the podcast Global Dispatches that came out a few months ago. And it caught our attention because you talked about having analysed the words that were used in some previous UN documents. And so you went quite far back to 2005, for example, World Summit Outcome, and I think also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015. What inspired you to do that rough search? And what were the words that you found?
Well, I would say that firstly, necessity is the mother of invention. What inspired me was really that I was entirely unprepared to record that podcast. And I was trying to think, what can I possibly say that might be distinctive and helpful and aligned with the approach that I think I'm trying to offer, which is less about specific groupings or identities or language in a document, but more about the normative frameworks, the conceptual frameworks that underlie our approach to multilateralism and our approach to change. And so I was forced to think about, how do I convey this qualitative shift in words that may have some quantitative connection? So I thought, let's just take advantage of technology, do a little Control F on these documents. And so I started with the word that I thought was most important at this moment in history, which is trust. And so I looked at trust in the Pact for the Future and its ancillary documents and found that it was mentioned 23 times, which is nice, I guess, but I had nothing to compare it to. So then I thought, well, what are the other documents that I can compare this to see if we're speaking more about trust now than we have in the past? Just having it mentioned may be good or it may not be good. It depends on, is this progress? So I thought, what were the other moments in history, recent history, where we had the same kind of conversation? And so the most recent one, while you say it's going back quite far, it was in 2005 with that World Summit. I think that was the last time that we had such an assessment of global governance at this scale. So that outcome was a natural one to use. But also because the Sustainable Development Goals are such a central element to both the Pact for the Future, but also to the UN in general, I thought, let's take that document that created that agenda and look there as well. So then we have 3 decades, 2005, 2015, and nearly 2025. And I think there you can start to see an evolution. So I started with trust, and I found it was mentioned only once in either of the previous two documents and 23 times this time. So then, that's a nice little hook. I started to think of other words: solidarity, just as in justice or injustice, generation, like intergenerational, evidence, data, science, human rights, peace. These words over and over again, I saw that the rate of mention, taking into consideration that the Pact for the Future is twice as long as the other two, the rate of mention for all of these words was actually higher. So generation, as in intergenerational, was mentioned 65 times in this document, but only 13 total in the previous two. So I think that this is telling in a way of a narrative about what we can say in public, how we can say it. And, it's a little bit separated. It's a degree or two removed from action on the ground, of course. But it is an indicator that allowed me to conceive of how humanity is articulating the problems that we're facing. And I find this to be quite compelling, that we're articulating them in a more sophisticated and profound way than we have in the past.
It's so interesting because, of course, we do talk about values, but there is very little discussion about them at the same time. So I wondered, how do you think we can also start to take a shift towards a long-term view on the global challenges?
Yeah, this long-term thinking is one of the real step changes it started in our common agenda, actually, the document that the Secretary General produced that gave birth to this Summit of the Future, in a sense, where I found, took a real stand about the UN's strategic advantage in looking generations ahead. The way that the processes work at the United Nations allow it to conceive of its work in decades rather than election cycles, so to speak. And I think he did well to embed himself in that kind of thinking, which then eventually gave rise to the Declaration on Future Generations. And I think that while the declaration didn't say everything we need, it actually opened the door quite wide to some new processes like an envoy on future generations. And more importantly, to me anyway, some new frameworks that we can use to assess the value of the work we're doing today, conceiving of it in a longer term vision. This is early days, I would say. And I think we have to be careful not to assume that now that we have this declaration, we're all going to be thinking 7 generations ahead. I don't think that we're quite there yet, but we have to start the conversation somewhere. And I think now there's a safe space to say, well, but how would this impact future generations? There's a safe space to think about solidarity, not only in terms of geographic scope, which we have done increasingly in recent decades, but also in temporal scope, which I think there are cultures in human history that have done this very well and continue to do this very well. But the dominant UN system, so to speak, has not done this as well as one might have hoped. So there is space now for this conversation. And the thing about norms is that you can't necessarily draw that line from a norm to a policy, but this is sort of the background music in which policy is created. So I think that there are a lot of wonderful hooks in the document, and more importantly, a conversation is open and a new norm has been established, that the work we do is not only for today, of course it must be for today, but also for future generations. And now there's an increasing framework to see what that looks like in practice.
Could we turn a little bit more to the values that you've talked about? Trust, solidarity, justice. And I think you just mentioned the way that some of these are demonstrated around the world. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Values are a hard thing. In a sense, there's this phrase, everything I need to know I learned in kindergarten, which I think is actually quite apt here. Because we seem sometimes to forget that we're all playing in the same sandbox together. We are one family on one planet, and what we do has implications on others. And it's so easy because of our mental models and sort of the way that we conceive of progress to forget the relational dimension to this. And why I'm saying all this as a preface to values is that these values are, I think, in a way inherent to who we are as human beings, but run the risk of being lost to other competing values, maybe more hedonistic values or accumulation related values or the desire for power. And so the question before us is, how do we return to or nurture those values that we think might allow us to play more collaboratively in the sandbox together? And that doesn't happen necessarily through a resolution at the UN, but it happens by slowly chipping away at and questioning the utility of a framework that we have. And the spaces that we have to chip away at that framework are many. We have them at the local level when we talk with our school boards. We have them at the national level, not only with elections, but with open consultations and plebiscites and all of this. And at the international level, we have them with the United Nations. The United Nations as a norm-setting space, I think, has a particular duty to ensure that it is projecting, at least in rhetoric and hopefully increasingly in action, projecting the kind of values that we wish to see for humanity. And I think if you take anyone on the street and you ask them, what are the values that you think should underlie a global system, they would probably say trust and justice and solidarity. This isn't rocket science. But the rocket science is in living the values despite the countervailing forces that we're facing. And so you can't really live those values if you haven't written them down. It's why, for example, in the UN Charter, I think the preamble is the most important bit because it sets the normative framework for the rest of it. The rest of it, we're trying to figure out the administrative structure, which is super important. But those values are the things that dictate our behavior, which then dictate our structures. So there are moments, they're rare, but they take place where we have the opportunity to question the values and to re-articulate them. And I think, again, this is why that word search to me was so much fun, because I saw a new set of values emerging in the way that we write about this moment in history.
How fascinating. And you said you started the word search with trust because you pinpoint that really as being essential. So, thinking about trust, what would you propose as a way of talking about trust and translating it into practical steps for rebuilding trust in the multilateral institutions?
One thing about the way we talk about trust is that it seems very trustee-centered. So we need to rebuild trust. We need to have trust in our institutions. My question has always been, how do we increase our trustworthiness? That is how you rebuild trust. It's by making a promise and fulfilling that promise. In a sense, it's one of the simplest things to do. It's hard to gain, in a sense, because you have to always be living up to the principles that you articulate. And it's very easy to lose trust, but it's not that complicated. It just requires a loyalty and a courage, a loyalty to truthfulness and a courage to stand up to injustice. That is really difficult when we are struggling with the boundedness of our identities, with the countervailing forces that are extant in society. So I think trust, I would love to see more reports done on trust. I actually know the UN has produced a couple, which are very interesting. But really, I would want to see it not about trust as a concept, but how we see and where we see trust building taking place and the effects that it has. Again, it's not as hard a science, but that doesn't make it any less important. There's the last thing I'll say about this is, in many cases, I find the way that we monitor trustworthiness is through accountability mechanisms. So you have a human rights framework, you have a court system, and that's all very important and very helpful. And I think that I would call it maybe a negative trust is really vital. But the reason that I don't steal from the grocery store is not because I'm afraid I'm going to get arrested or because of the court system. It's because as a normative value, it's wrong. It's just plumb wrong. And I think the vast majority of people don't steal because it's the wrong thing to do. And that's the norm that I think we need to establish, more this positive notion of accountability. How do we create a society where we just do what's right because it's right? And that's a very hard thing to ask for, especially in moments of profound suffering. I know that I'm speaking, maybe someone would accuse me of a privileged conversation. But I think that actually at the very local level in communities of wealth and living in poverty, all of them need to have this fabric of trust that underlies a functioning society. So I don't quite agree that it's a conversation of privilege. It's a conversation about the way that a multilateral system can function. If we can't trust the word of another nation, the word of the person sitting across the table from us, why would we be trustworthy? And how can we expect progress to take place? And that is why I think this trust deficit is so important to be overcome. And I'm grateful that it appeared so many times in this pact. Now the question is, how do we bring that mention in text to the tables of negotiation and to the promises that we have made in all of these international spaces?
Very true. What do you think has led to this shift, though, in the normative values, the changing global priorities that we now have?
I think that the first big change that I think we've seen in recent decades is this information revolution. We are all better informed, sometimes in ways that may not lead to greater unity, but we all have greater access to information. And some of that information is true and some may not be. But we all can see injustice much more clearly in our phones, in our computers, day to day. And I think that when we see this, you can't just shrug it off as something that's happening over there, because it is in front of us. And so this new recognition of, the tremendous dichotomy of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, or the history of injustice, the way that humanity's progress has unfolded thus far, this knowledge, I think, is forcing us to confront a real cognitive dissonance. And the only way to resolve that cognitive dissonance is to return to some of these values that are so important, maybe in the family and in the community, these values of trustworthiness, sacrifice, and interdependence. And if we don't do that, I think it's increasingly seen, then these crises are going to perpetuate and even accelerate. So it's really about, to me, the information that's available that can allow us to maybe move in new directions.
So then, how do you see the outcomes of the summit for the future aligning with these values, trust, solidarity, justice, and so on, that seem to be emerging in our world today?
The first thing I would say is just taking a step back. If you told me that there were going to be the kinds of wars that we see in the world today, the kinds of injustice, extreme wealth and poverty, the climate change, the nature crisis that we see, despite, or in some ways because of, but certainly despite all of that, if you were to say, we're going to get an agreement at the UN that will be adopted by consensus about the Security Council, about a digital compact, about future generations, the international financial architecture reform. If you said that in this context, we were going to get that agreement, I would have laughed at you and said, that is not going to happen. So I think in terms of trust and solidarity and justice, the mere existence of these three documents is a demonstration of that. So I think that's a really important starting point, because often we get into the weeds and we want to criticize this action or this paragraph, or this is too much in one direction and too much in another. Maybe, but the fact is that we came together and we shook hands despite wars raging in nearly every region and, a climate change crisis that we've never confronted before. So I think it's important just to hold that in our minds. And then how do we see the outcomes aligning with these values? That's really up to the member states and up to us. How is it that we can ensure that those things that are so positive in this document can find expression in the spaces where decisions are made? Of course, a summit like this is not a space where true policy is created. It's a very normative space. And it's one other important dimension is that it was heads of state that agreed to this. So if it's at heads of state level, that should provide some marching orders for the places of policy. And we have many places of policy that are coming up in this 12-month period. We have financing for development, a social summit, more climate change COPs. All of these things are taking place. Commission on the Status of Women. I know I'm going to exclude many important spaces, high G20, but our job now is to ensure that those principles are able to find expression in the policy documents that are produced in these other spaces. That is a tough ask, especially, again, given this context. But we've seen that it can happen. And in order for trust, solidarity, justice, and these other principles to find expression, it has to be by figuring out how to translate them from this normative document into the policy, which then can impact people at the local level.
Well, we all hope for that. I heard you throw in another word, interdependence, earlier, and I'm sure that that is a topic that is very central to you. If we do then accept that interdependence is an important reality to embrace, why do you think embracing it is so vital?
I think interdependence is like gravity. It's a thing that exists, whether we like it or not. And it's a thing that we can either try to describe and analyze and understand and use it to our advantage, or it's a thing that will just continue to be there that we sort of ignore at our own peril. In one scenario, we continue to live as we do. And in the other scenario, we can use the tools of gravity to fly to the moon. I think that the knowledge is there, the reality is clear. Even if we struggle with seeing its implications at this moment in history, the trajectory is undeniable that we are increasingly interdependent as a human society and, in fact, as an Earth system. And if that's the case, then it's to our tremendous benefit to figure out how we get to the moon. How do we harness this interdependence in a way that can allow the full expression of our diversity without excluding others, in a way that draws on myriad forms of knowledge that exist in the world and uses them to better the human condition and the condition of the world. Again, I don't think that this is a question of whether or not interdependence is there. The question is, how can we embrace it in order to ensure that future generations and even current generations are able to fulfill their greatest potential?
And so then how would you say that we can use that principle in a process of decision-making at the international level? What would that look like?
I think this question is really radical. What would it look like to start a consultation at the United Nations with the principle that we are all part of one shared family on one shared planet? And that would mean that the decisions I take have to take into consideration the needs of others, both the needs of others today, other nations, other societies, but also future generations. And this is a really fundamentally different framework from the sovereignty-based model that we currently have. And I don't want to offer any disrespect to the current model. It has really moved us in tremendous ways from where we were in previous eras of human history. But that doesn't mean that it is at its final state of evolution. Most of the decision-making we see takes place on short time horizons. It's based on loyalty to a government that, in most cases, in all that we've seen in human history, has an expiration date. But interdependence requires a very long time horizon, right? Recognizing that even a short-term win may, in a sense, be a long-term loss if it has negative implications on others. It requires the first question we ask to be about what would this mean for our relationships with others, rather than what would this mean for me? And by me, I mean nations in large part. It's essentially going from being single to being part of a family. And that's a big leap, especially for those who love being single. And I think we just need to recognize that this is a process that is unfolding. And then the final thing that is really vital, and maybe I should have started with this, is that it would require that agreements we make, promises we make, have to be adhered to at the domestic level. We can't say that we truly embrace our interdependence by having an agreement to do X, Y, or Z, give A, B, or C, and then we go back to our national level and the finance ministry says no. You can't have that in an interdependent society. How would you expect a functioning relationship, a functioning family to exist if that was the kind of behavior that was permitted. And so I think that this is going to increasingly have to be the lens of analysis at the multilateral level. And it's going to happen because this prisoner's dilemma, this tragedy of the commons approach that we have now cannot sustain us forever. And so we have to decide, are we going to do this by collective choice, seeing the writing on the wall today, or will it take further tragedy? And I'm here rooting for the former so that we can avoid that tragedy and just get to the good stuff. Figure out how much love we can create in this family. And it sounds very soft and naive, but I do think it's inevitable. And it's just how do we get from here to there? And so I'm hoping that there are listeners and there are others who are doing their part to help bring this about.
Absolutely. And you brought the conversation back to trust again, I think. So talking about the Pact for the Future, how do you think that's going to affect conversations on governance?
So the Pact for the Future is another attempt, and I think it's a very good attempt, but it's like a child walking. The first steps that are taken often result in a degree of failure. We would never call those first steps a failure. And I think that's actually an important lesson as well. Those first steps of a child walking are a celebration, even though they fall after a couple of attempts. So I think this is what the Summit of the Future represents. Just as the League of Nations was an important step forward in humanity's trajectory towards interdependence, the United Nations is similar. Maybe we don't need a third. Maybe we can reform this one by questioning our structures of global governance, or maybe we do. I'm not so much attached to the name of the institution, but I am attached to this notion of continuing a conversation, continuing to question, not too frequently. We don't need to do it every year. I think we wouldn't have time to learn were that the case. But this every decade aspiration, I think, is actually quite a nice cadence. So we had those huge conferences in the 1990s, which were a real step forward, and then the World Summit, Agenda 2030, and here we are. So I think, like all of these steps before, this Pact for the Future represents another step in our progress towards figuring out how to walk as one collective species. And it doesn't mean that we've succeeded, but wherever there have been shortcomings are opportunities to learn.
I'm really enjoying these metaphors of childhood and sandboxes and play and joy in this.
You can thank my children for that.
So you've spoken about going to the various conferences, and you've just mentioned them now, and you started the conversation by saying that your role is to be involved in the UN processes and so on. I'd like you to talk a bit more about civil society and the important role that it does play in the processes, especially because in some ways it's not very visible sometimes. Would you tell us a bit more about how civil society collaborated and contributed to the Pact and other processes? And also, how do you think that civil society can best influence these high-level dialogues?
So I'm going to speak to 3 channels. So I'll try and disaggregate them. But one of them is the very formal channel that the UN and the member states open to civil society through ECOSOC accreditation and through some other mechanisms that exist. A second channel is the informal international exchange. So even if the first channel might be closed, or even if it's open, there are these opportunities for exchange with diplomats at the international level. And then the third channel is the domestic level. And I think these 3 different strategies and spaces each offer certain benefits and have their limitations. And civil society is in all of them. So for the Pact for the Future, the Summit of the Future process, the question of civil society participation was quite fraught. There were some member states who were saying this is exclusively a member state process. There's no space for civil society. This needs to just be us. And the co-facilitators, to their credit, tried their best to find ways to open the space so that civil society could contribute formally. It was imperfect. It wasn't as inclusive as the 2015 process, but it still offered a few opportunities. And if for nothing else, it was good for relationship building, which could facilitate that second level. So some of the opportunities were things like submissions of perspectives at key moments in the drafting process, or open dialogues, digital open dialogues where civil society could share their perspectives. And then there was a major civil society conference that took place in Nairobi in May. And all of these were very helpful. I think that there are limits to what they can achieve, but all in all, they are to the good. The second level is informal exchange with diplomats and others at the UN. Just because you can't get into a room where people are negotiating doesn't mean you can't call them or run into them in the hallway or send them an email. And this is actually the less visible type of engagement, but I think far more impactful. I do know that there are certain things in the Pact that were a result of exchanges between members of civil society and member states that were not public. And I'm not to make them public. But this does take place, and it's not nefarious. It's not like a Trojan horse thing. It's that the member states, the delegates, poor delegates, can't be professionals and experts in every single area of the Pact for the Future. And so they turn to civil society and others for their knowledge and expertise on these issues. And civil society does their best to provide it. We at the Baha'i International Community's office opened up a space roughly every month for dialogues that were open to civil society and member states and UN agencies. And we had, I think, a total of over 80 member states come throughout the process, and 1,000 or 2,000 members of civil society. In aggregate, it was a lot of people were there, and that fostered this relationship building. I heard later that one of the key member states expressed gratitude to us for doing this because they could not. As soon as they host a space in their mission, it carries certain assumptions and biases, and at the UN, we know it can be quite a challenge. So in a way, civil society can be the oil that allows, maybe the oil is a bad analogy given the climate crisis, but it can be a lubricant to allow for these things to progress. And then the third way is at capital. And I think we often find greatest difficulty engaging at the national level on international issues. It's difficult for two reasons. One is because naturally, when you're at your capital, the most important issues are domestic. People who are in the ministries are thinking about the concerns of their citizenry within those borders. And that's valid and important. But despite this challenge, the more we can, as civil society, articulate the global nature of some of these challenges and our aspirations for member states in New York to take certain steps, the better off we'll be. And I think actually in terms of impact, if you have a good connection at capital and strong evidentiary basis, that can have the greatest impact, because that ultimately is what leads to démarches to the delegates here, and then the policy that comes out. So each of these levels is quite important. For us at the Baha'i International Community in New York, we're most focused on the formal spaces and the informal ones at this level, but there are Baha'is all over the world who are engaged in conversation with their government officials. And I think it's really important to recognize that this is meant to be a cooperative endeavor where we are collectively using our strategic advantages to try and advance the well-being of humanity. It doesn't have to be competitive or adversarial. It's the forum of ideas and exchange that can allow for new approaches and new knowledge to emerge. And I think if that's the spirit with which we take it, all of these approaches and many more will continue to benefit the international community.
That as a forum for new ideas and exchange, it really is a beautiful idea. That's the process for contributing to the Pact for the Future. But in what way does civil society have a role then in the outcomes of that and furthering it?
Sure. Yeah, that's the creation of the cake. And then how do we eat it? So this is, as referenced earlier, going to be about ensuring that the normative advances in the Pact and its ancillary documents are brought to bear on conversations going forward. It is all too easy to say that that summit of the future came and went. It's behind us now. What's the next thing? But if we do that, and if the member states do that, then we are all going to miss out on the benefits that could accrue from our references to that document, our taking of positive language from that document into these other spaces. One small example I'll raise is there's a second World Social Summit taking place next November. And this is building on the first World Social Summit in Copenhagen in 1995. And I was speaking with some UN colleagues about what new thing could we be talking about, in addition to the principles that came up from Copenhagen, which are related to poverty eradication, full employment, and social cohesion. What else is there? And I said, well, in the Pact, they talk about moving beyond GDP. Maybe this is a concept that could be introduced as part of a new eco-social contract, as UNRWA talks about. And the colleagues were saying, yes, that's actually a really interesting idea. Not to say that they've committed to it, of course, but what are these ideas that are in the Pact that can be brought to bear on these next processes? And, in the FFD process, it might be a wealth tax. There are all kinds of things, little ornaments that we can bring into these other spaces. And that, I think, at the international level is how civil society can bring it forward. And then at the national level, it has to be just ensuring that these norms and values are brought to bear on domestic policy, on the conversations at the national and even the local level. Again, it's a soft connection because this is not a legally binding document, but it is a connection, no less, that we have to try and reinforce.
And where do we find the power for driving that change?
For me, it comes from the reality that we're choosing between two roads: the road of collective decision-making or the road of collective crisis. And I much prefer that first one. And so that is why at any given moment, it's easy to find the motivation to do the right thing. What's that quote? It's always the right time to do the right thing.
Absolutely. I'd like to follow that path too. So how can individuals play a role in fostering interdependence and cooperation and moving towards that path?
For me, this starts with the concept of agency. We all have the capacity to do the right thing or the capacity to choose our own short-term interest. I think ultimately we know at some level that 2 hours spent watching a movie is less fulfilling than 2 hours spent cleaning up a neighborhood. And yet, almost all of us would rather just sit down with a cup of tea and watch a movie. And it's one of those great dichotomies that I think we have to try and overcome our tendencies for that short-term pleasure. And that can happen in any framework, in any moment, whether it's with our children or with our parents or in our communities or in the decision-making halls of the United Nations. And I think this individual agency is often overlooked when we talk about the role of the institution. Institutions are just built of individuals. And so here I think the role of the individual is so vital because we can develop a human connection with anybody. I know nobody who doesn't enjoy laughter. We can all share that moment, and then it creates this affinity, and then we can problem solve. But if we approach each other as if they are the enemy, as if they are the other, it's going to be far more difficult to problem solve. So we have this individual responsibility that we can all engage with at any given moment, and just trust that in aggregate, that does make a difference.
It does indeed. So, Daniel, it's been absolutely energizing, I would say, to hear you talk about these values. As we wrap up, what message would you like to leave us with?
Yeah, so I saw this in the questions, and this is the hardest one, right? Which is, what is the final message that you would like people to have as the taste in their mouth when they go away? I think it's this, that the one constant in the course of human history is change. The UN is neither the first nor the final expression of international cooperation. And if that's the case, then we have a duty to use it as best we can, but always to keep a second eye sort of off in the distance. We can't be naive to the realities of the world in which we live, but we have to be prepared for when there's going to be these moments of shift in our societies. And so what I often find myself doing in the way that I stay energized is I cast my mind far into the future. We're post-climate change, we're post-war, societies are far more equal. And I ask myself, what did it take for us to get there? And then once I think about that, the question is, what steps do I take now on that path? And this mental exercise, while I don't always have the answers to it, it keeps me optimistic and energized, regardless of the stormy seas in which we currently exist. Because we're always thinking, what is that future towards which we're working? And what are the steps I can take at this moment to get us there?
Daniel, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.